Welcome back to Guns 101, an introduction for new firearms owners. It's brought to you by the Self-Defense Radio Network. I'm Rob Morse from Self-Defense Gun Stories. My partners in this adventure are Amanda Suffolk from Eye on the Target Radio, Paul Lathrop, the guy doing the heavy lifting there in the tech chair, from the Polite Society podcast. We have Paul Carlson with us from Safety Solutions Academy. Paul, a lot of people brought home a box. They haven't had enough time, enough instruction to know what it feels like when they shoot it. What can they learn through what we call dry practice? Practice when there is no explosion of a cartridge going off.
Yeah, there's a lot that can be learned from dry practice, or what a lot of people call dry fire, Rob. And I think the most important thing that we talk about right at the outset is that practice needs to be dry. What I mean by that is, you mentioned that dry practice is when there's no explosion. We need to ensure that that's the case. So before you engage in dry practice, I want you to verify that your firearm is unloaded both in the chamber and in the magazine. Distract yourself, verify it again, and then make sure that all ammunition is removed from the area. In fact, take it right out of the room so that there's no possible way that ammunition could be introduced into your firearm during that dry practice. That could turn a typical practice session into a tragedy, so we want to make sure that we're careful of that. Also, make sure you have a safe place for that dry practice. We talked in our storage and staging video about the idea of creating that space. All it would take is a couple of bags of sand and a couple of 5-gallon buckets for you to build a corner in your home someplace, whether that's down the basement or someplace else in your garage, where if there were to be some kind of an introduction of ammunition into the firearm, that it would not result in a tragedy. So make sure you think about those things before you get going. So dry practice, the idea is to learn and practice the fundamentals of gun handling without ammunition. And it certainly has some advantages. By removing the recoil, we take away a lot of the startle response that our body has when we're holding literally an explosion in our hand. So that can really help us to perfect the use of the sights and how it is that we press the trigger. But one of the things I want people to think about is that feedback that comes from live ammunition, putting a hole in the target, that gives us information about how well we did. Well, with dry practice, that feedback is gone. And so we want to look for some ways to reintroduce that if we can. But let's just start with some ideas about what it is that we can practice. The first thing I would say that can be practiced with dry practice is just gripping your gun. You can simply, in dry practice, never needing to press the trigger, practice establishing a proper grip on the handgun. We want to habitualize that both in position and pressure, so that whenever we pick up the gun, we pick it up in exactly the way that we want to use it should we need to defend ourselves. So that's one of the things that we can practice. Another skill that people have a really difficult time with in general is racking and locking the slide to the rear. In fact, I'm an expert, so-called, right? And the Springfield Hellcat is a smaller gun. I actually have a difficult time locking the slide to the rear. In one of the videos we shot today, I actually had to try it a second time because I missed the slide stop lever in pushing it up. And so one of the things we can do is simply practice locking the slide to the rear. I'm going to make sure my thumb is in the right position to push up on the lever, and then I rack the slide to the rear, and I've got it locked back. That's something that we can practice dry. We can practice reloading the firearm or loading the firearm at all. We can do that with a magazine and just practice that process of inserting the magazine. Or if you want to get really fancy, you could take and remove the base pad, pull the spring and the follower out of this magazine, put the base pad back on, and then you've got the ability to load the gun and rack the slide, and it'll cycle the slide. Kind of cool, right? Then, of course, there's pressing the trigger, right? We can work on the idea of how it is that we press the trigger. We get that perfect grip. We choose a target close, far, small, large, whatever it might be. We can drive the gun out, and then we can use the sight alignment, sight placement, put the pressure on the trigger, press to the rear. And the idea is we can do that without moving the gun at all. That's great practice. We simply cycle the slide, and we can practice again. Now, one of the things to think about, I mentioned before, is that when we're doing dry practice, we don't have the feedback that we have with the ringing of the steel or a hole being punched in a piece of paper. And there are a lot of great tools out there that can help you to get that feedback. Maybe you purchased a firearm that has a laser module on it. You can put that laser on the target, and what you would be watching for is watching for movement of that laser when you press the trigger. You want it to stay on the target all of the time that you're pressing the trigger. Or maybe you purchase a dummy round that actually has a laser embedded in it. And so it's going to give you a little laser flash when the hammer drops or the striker impacts the back of that cartridge. So that would put a laser dot on your target for a fraction of a second that you could see and verify that you're doing the work. I like to use this Mantis module. This Mantis is a tool that pairs with my iPhone, and it actually measures the movement of the gun before, during, and after the trigger press, both in dry fire and live fire, and it gives me a lot of information. And so that's something, especially if you're stuck at home right now, you might look at picking up a unit like this, or there are lots of other options like a SIRT pistol, which a SIRT pistol has, it's an inert gun that models after some of the more popular models like a Glock or a Smith & Wesson M&P, and that has built-in laser modules that you can use, or a Cool Fire Trainer, which is a CO2 powered gun that runs the slide and actually gives you some kind of recoil. All of those things can really help when it comes to dry practice. I think the biggest key to dry practice, when we get beyond the responsibility of making sure that it stays dry, is making sure that we do things perfectly. If we're practicing in a sloppy manner, all we're going to do is habituate sloppy manipulations of the gun, and that's not what it is that we want. So I'd encourage you, if you're stuck at home and you want to get familiar with your firearm, check out Claude Werner. He's got a dry fire practice book that gives you a routine of dry fire that you can check out. Look for other resources on the internet. There's a lot out there, and maybe pick up one of those accessories for your firearm to help that dry fire or dry practice be more feedback filled for you to be able to develop your skills.
Amanda, before you close, Paul, you were a professional shooter for a time on the competition circuit. Compared to your time at the range, do you think you put in more time with dry practice or more time at the range?
So during that time, I was semi-professional, Rob, I guess I would say. I was hopeful of being a professional someday. And I spent a lot of time live fire, but, I had the same restrictions that anybody else has. It's a 35-minute drive to the range. There's the unload time, the get ready time, the setup time. And so there were definitely times when dry fire was an integral part of what it is that I was doing, both dry fire and visualization. And so I spent a lot of time dry firing then. I don't spend as much time as I would like to now. And that's something I'd like to get back to. Now that I work in the firearms industry full time, and it's been that way for many years, it's awful hard to get any shooting done, it seems like, at least shooting for me, for my purposes. And so dry fire is a great solution for that I should be taking advantage of, especially since, folks like Mantis help me out and send me gear to test like this that really makes the feedback aspect unbelievable.
Yeah, isn't that the Mantis and the Mantis X is an amazing thing. And I'm gonna push it this way. If you are a new shooter, it would benefit you to have it. If you are looking for a gift for a new or an experienced shooter, this is one of those things they probably don't have, but they would benefit from having, no matter where their experience level is. So
the neatest thing.
Go ahead.
The X10 Elite, which is the newest model, and it also happens to be the most expensive, so people need to factor that in. I'm finding that that's giving me feedback about my shooting that I've been looking for years. When I'm making minor changes in my grip, the Mantis X10 Elite actually measures the recoil impulse. And so I can see how my grip is changing how the gun moves in recoil minutely, like tiny movements. And that's very helpful for me to try and refine my skills. So whatever level you're at, brand new or seasoned expert, there's no doubt that this tool and many of the other tools that I mentioned could be helpful in giving you feedback to improve your shooting.
There you go. I've got one thing that I want to reiterate that you had said, which was to check that it's empty and then check it again and then check it again. So I strongly recommend you pick a special area that you never take ammunition to that area, so that there's not ever an opportunity for you to just kind of pull it up and, oh, I'll dry fire and find out it's not. I had a student a couple years ago who was doing a dry fire exercise, got all done, loaded their gun, put it back in their pants, and then for some reason pulled it back out and fired a shot. And he fired it laterally through his wife's closet. Through every piece of clothing she owns, there was a hole. Every piece of clothing. So it was an expensive, a very expensive mistake that he made. It didn't cost anyone their life. It could have been way worse. But it was pretty bad. So those are the things that you don't want to do. You want to make sure that you've got a special area, your gun is clear, check it. It's your responsibility. And Paul, I think you covered that very, very well. So Paul Carlson, SafetySolutionsAcademy.com. Look him up. He's kind of a big deal.